At 11:23 a.m. on February 16, 2026, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb received intelligence that made his 18 years of Afghanistan experience suddenly obsolete. Webb was 42 years old, Defense Intelligence Agency analyst, Kabul station from 2010 to 2012. 2 combat tours, expert on Taliban force structure and capabilities, and now sitting in his office at the Pentagon, he was reading intercepts that changed everything he thought he understood about Afghanistan's role in a potential Iran war. Zabihullah Mujahid, Taliban spokesperson, had appeared on Iranian state television just hours earlier. His message was unambiguous. According to reports published by Breitbart at 1100 hours Eastern Time and verified by multiple regional outlets, Mujahid stated that Afghanistan would be prepared to cooperate with Iran in the event of a U.S. attack if requested by Tehran. Not might cooperate. Not would consider cooperation. Prepared to cooperate. With specifics, with timelines, with commitment that sounded operationally real rather than rhetorically symbolic. The statement came with corroboration. Mohammed Yaqub, Taliban's so-called defense minister and son of the movement's founder Mullah Omar, had issued parallel remarks on the same day according to the Arabic outlet Shafaq News. Yaqub's language was more direct. The Taliban would cooperate if necessary with Iran to ward off an American attack. Ward off. Not condemn. Not protest through diplomatic channels. Ward off. Military language, defensive operations language. The kind of phrasing that suggested planning had occurred. Discussions had happened, and positions had been coordinated between Kabul and Tehran in ways American intelligence hadn't detected. Webb pulled up force assessment documents that his team had compiled 3 months earlier. According to Defense Intelligence Agency estimates updated in November 2025, the Taliban controlled approximately 100,000 to 120,000 active fighters across Afghanistan. Not police, not administrators, fighters, men with weapons and training and combat experience who'd spent 20 years fighting the most powerful military in human history and had won. Those 100,000 fighters were positioned throughout a country that bordered Iran to the west, a country where America no longer maintained significant military presence after withdrawing in August 2021. A country that could, if the Taliban chose, become Iran's eastern front, opening a second theater, forcing American forces to fight not just in the Arabian Gulf but in Central Asia, stretching resources, dividing attention, and potentially trapping American personnel in a landlocked country surrounded by hostile forces with no easy evacuation routes. The implications spiraled outward from that core reality. If Iran and the Taliban coordinated, American forces planning operations against Iranian nuclear facilities would face threats from 2 directions. Carriers in the Gulf would be vulnerable to Iranian ballistic missiles from the west, while Taliban fighters could potentially threaten the limited American presence still operating in Afghanistan, including contractors, intelligence personnel, and embassy staff. More critically, if fighting started and the Taliban activated their 100,000 fighters in support of Iran, American options for basing, overflight, and logistics through Central Asia would collapse. Pakistan would never support American operations against an Iran-Taliban alliance. Russia would block northern routes. China would object to any American military activity near its western border. And suddenly, the war that Pentagon planners had been designing for the past 6 months, the carrier-based aerial campaign with regional support, would become exponentially more complex, more dangerous, and potentially unwinnable. But to understand how the Taliban went from fighting America for 20 years to potentially allying with Iran against America, you need to understand a relationship that shouldn't exist. Between Sunni extremists in Kabul and Shia theocrats in Tehran, between movements that have historically hated each other almost as much as they hate the United States. And yet, over the past 5 years, that impossible relationship had become not just possible, but operational. According to Wikipedia documentation published just 6 hours ago, inciting intelligence assessments from the 2026 United States-Iran crisis, Iran has been cultivating the Taliban since at least 2015. The relationship began as tactical convenience. Iran wanted to contain the Islamic State Khorasan province, the ISIS affiliate that had emerged in eastern Afghanistan and was conducting attacks against Iranian interests. The Taliban wanted weapons and sanctuary. So, despite ideological differences, despite sectarian divides, Iran provided the Taliban with Iranian-made weaponry, safe haven for leadership, and even opened liaison offices in Zahedan and Mashhad, where Taliban commanders could coordinate operations. The cooperation escalated after 2020. According to academic research published in peer-reviewed journals and cited by the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, Iran sought Taliban assistance to increase attacks against American forces in northern and western Afghanistan following the January 2020 assassination of IRGC General Qasem Soleimani. On January 28, 2020, a U.S. E-11 surveillance aircraft was shot down over Afghanistan, reportedly with Iranian technical assistance provided to the Taliban. The crash killed several Americans, including a CIA official who had overseen operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran. That incident proved that Iran-Taliban cooperation wasn't theoretical, it was lethal. And it worked. After the Taliban returned to power in August 2021, Iran was among the first governments to establish diplomatic relations with the new regime. According to Wikipedia and multiple diplomatic sources, Iran appointed Hassan Kazemi Komi, an IRGC member, as ambassador to Afghanistan in 2023. The Taliban's chargé d'affaires was accredited by Iran on February 26, 2023, full diplomatic exchange, not recognition of legitimacy, but operational engagement that allowed both sides to coordinate on shared interests. Those shared interests had expanded by 2026. According to reporting by Special Eurasia, published just 4 hours ago, Iran and Afghanistan had established the Dogharoon Free Trade Industrial Zone on their shared border in 2023, directly connected to Afghanistan's Herat province. Iran's Deputy Oil Minister, Sayed Ali Mohammad Musavi, had visited Kabul to discuss expanding petroleum and liquefied gas exports, refinery modernization, and mineral investment. The Taliban requested preferential pricing and transit facilitation. This wasn't just diplomacy, this was economic integration. Iran was embedding Afghanistan into its economy, creating dependencies that would make the Taliban reliant on Iranian goodwill, and therefore responsive to Iranian requests. The relationship hadn't been smooth. According to multiple sources, including Wikipedia, tensions had flared in May 2023 over water rights to the Helmand River. A border clash occurred. Taliban local commander Abdul Hamid Khorasani threatened to conquer Iran if water disputes continued. Iranian officials responded with threats of their own, but senior officials from both sides called for de-escalation. And within months, the relationship had stabilized again, because both sides needed each other. Iran needed a stable Afghanistan that wouldn't become a platform for ISIS or American intelligence. The Taliban needed Iranian economic support, weapons, and diplomatic cover from a government that could engage with Russia and China on their behalf. On January 26, 2025, according to Wikipedia documentation, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi led a delegation to Kabul. It was the first visit by a senior Iranian official since 2017. Araghchi met with Afghan Acting Prime Minister Hassan Ahund and Defense Minister Mohammad Yaqub to discuss border tensions, Afghan refugees in Iran, and water rights. But the visit signaled something beyond crisis management. It signaled strategic alignment, because you don't send your foreign minister to Kabul unless the relationship matters, unless plans exist that require coordination at the highest levels. And now, on February 16, 2026, as American carriers steam toward the Arabian Gulf and Trump publicly advocated regime change in Iran, those plans were becoming public. Mujahid's statement on Iranian television wasn't improvised. According to Al-Mayadeen, reporting cited by multiple outlets, Mujahid said the people of Afghanistan would stand in solidarity and offer various forms of support to their Iranian brothers. Hama Press paraphrased his comments as stating the Taliban would show support and possible cooperation with Iran if requested, in the event of American military action. This was coordinated messaging, approved at senior levels, designed to send a signal to Washington that attacking Iran wouldn't be isolated to the Gulf. It would activate alliances that could open multiple fronts simultaneously. And now, at his desk in the Pentagon on February 16th, Lieutenant Colonel Webb was trying to game out what Taliban involvement actually meant. He pulled up operational maps showing American presence in Afghanistan. The numbers were smaller than most people realized. After the chaotic withdrawal in August 2021, America no longer maintained military bases in the country, but according to classified assessments Webb had access to, approximately 200 to 300 American personnel remained in Afghanistan. Embassy staff, intelligence operatives, contractors providing security and logistical support, not enough to fight a war, but enough to become hostages if the Taliban decided to act. Webb cross-referenced Taliban force positions with those American locations. The results were concerning. Every American facility in Kabul was within minutes of Taliban checkpoints. The embassy, fortified after the withdrawal, was surrounded by Taliban-controlled territory. If Mujahid's statement was operationalized, if the Taliban actually moved to cooperate with Iran by targeting American presence, those 200 to 300 Americans would be isolated, cut off, and facing capture or worse within hours. Evacuation routes didn't exist. The airport was Taliban-controlled. Overland routes to Pakistan would require crossing Taliban territory, and air evacuation would require overflight. Permissions from countries that wouldn't grant them if the Taliban were aligned with Iran. But the threat extended beyond personnel in Afghanistan. Webb pulled up Central Asia basing documents. According to Defense Department planning materials, If war with Iran escalated, American forces would need access to bases in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or Kyrgyzstan for search and rescue operations, intelligence collection, and potential ground force staging. Those bases had been negotiated in the 2000s for Afghanistan operations. But all three countries bordered Afghanistan. All three would face Taliban pressure if the Taliban aligned with Iran. And all three had made clear through diplomatic channels that they wouldn't support American operations that risked conflict with their neighbors. The geography created a strategic trap. American forces attacking Iran from carriers in the Gulf would be operating at maximum range. If operations went wrong, if aircraft were shot down or personnel were captured, the closest safe havens would be in Central Asia. But if those bases were unavailable because host nations feared Taliban retaliation, downed pilots would have nowhere to go. Search and rescue operations would become suicide missions, and casualties would mount not because American forces were defeated in combat, but because regional geography and Taliban pressure had eliminated escape routes that military planners assumed would be available. Russia's role complicated calculations further. According to intelligence assessments, Russia had been building relationships with the Taliban since before the American withdrawal. Russia was reportedly the only state to have formally recognized the Taliban government, according to Special Eurasia analysis. If the Taliban cooperated with Iran and Russia supported both, the entire northern approach to Afghanistan would be closed to American forces. Pakistan to the south had already indicated through diplomatic channels it wouldn't support operations against Iran. That left only one route into the region, through the Arabian Gulf, exactly where Iran's military was strongest. At 13:45 hours, Webb attended a secure video conference with CENTCOM intelligence officers. The topic was Taliban capabilities in a contingency scenario. The briefing officer, a Navy captain Webb had worked with during Afghanistan deployments, laid out the assessment clinically. The Taliban controls approximately 100,000 to 120,000 fighters. These aren't insurgents. They're the government. They have access to billions of dollars in American military equipment left behind during the 2021 withdrawal, including small arms, vehicles, night vision equipment, and potentially some aircraft and helicopters. They've been fighting continuously for 45 years. First against the Soviets, then against the Afghan government, then against us. They know the terrain. They know how to operate without air support. And they've proven they can sustain operations indefinitely against superior forces. Someone asked the obvious question, if the Taliban activated those 100,000 fighters in support of Iran, what could they actually do? The captain's response was measured but concerning. Direct attacks on American forces in the Gulf? Unlikely. They don't have that capability. But harassment of American personnel in Afghanistan? Absolutely. Pressure on Pakistan to close airspace? Very possible. Coordination with Iranian proxies across the region? Almost certain. The Taliban has connections to militant groups throughout Central and South Asia. If they activated those networks, American forces would face threats in multiple countries simultaneously, not existential threats, but enough to complicate operations, enough to stretch resources, enough to turn a focused campaign against Iran into a diffuse regional conflict with no clear endpoints. Webb spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing historical parallels. The closest comparison was the Soviet experience in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. The Soviets had invaded with 100,000 troops, controlled major cities, had air superiority, and spent 10 years bleeding resources and personnel before withdrawing in defeat. The Mujahideen who'd fought them had been supplied by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Now those same networks, evolved into the Taliban, were potentially aligning with Iran. And if America struck Iran, the Taliban could activate the same guerrilla warfare tactics that had defeated the Soviets. Not against American forces invading Afghanistan, against American forces anywhere in the region that could be reached by Taliban-linked militants. The strategic nightmare was clear. America could destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, could degrade its military, could even achieve regime change if enough force was applied. But none of that would matter if the Taliban opened a second front. That required resources America didn't have to spare. If American personnel in Afghanistan became hostages, if Central Asian bases became unavailable, if Pakistan closed its airspace, if militant attacks spread across the region, the focused military operation planned for Iran would metastasize into a regional war with multiple adversaries, unclear objectives, and no exit strategy. At 17:30 hours, Webb made a decision. He drafted a memo to his division chief. Subject line, Taliban-Iran cooperation poses strategic risk to Iran operations. The memo was direct. Mujahid's statement should be treated as operationally credible. The Taliban has the capability to complicate American military action against Iran. Recommend immediate diplomatic engagement with Kabul to clarify consequences if the Taliban acts on its stated willingness to cooperate with Tehran. And recommend contingency planning for extraction of American personnel from Afghanistan if hostilities begin. 6 hours later, the memo had reached CENTCOM Commander General Richard Clark's desk. and the response was immediate. At 01:30 hours on February 17th, Webb received a secure call requesting his presence at an emergency intelligence briefing scheduled for 0600. When he arrived at the SCEF, the room was full. 15 senior officers, Joint Chiefs Representation, CIA, State Department, everyone who needed to understand what the Taliban threat meant for Iran operations. General Clark opened the briefing with characteristic directness. Gentlemen, we have a problem. For the past 3 months, we've been planning operations against Iran based on the assumption that the conflict would be contained to the Gulf, naval air power, carrier strikes, regional basing in UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. But if the Taliban activates in support of Iran, that assumption is wrong, and everything we've planned changes. The CIA station chief for South Asia provided context that Webb hadn't seen in open reporting. According to signals intelligence collected over the past 48 hours, Taliban leadership had been in contact with IRGC officials in Tehran. The communications weren't detailed enough to reveal operational plans, but the frequency and seniority of participants suggested this wasn't rhetorical solidarity. It was coordination, planning, preparation for contingencies that both sides expected might occur soon. More concerning, according to the station chief, were reports from human intelligence sources in Kabul. Taliban commanders had reportedly been briefed in recent days on defensive measures to protect Islamic Republic interests. That phrasing was specific. Not prepare for American aggression, not defend Afghanistan, protect Islamic Republic interests, meaning Iran's interests, which suggested the Taliban had accepted a role as Iran's Eastern Auxiliary Force, ready to act if Tehran requested support. The State Department representative provided diplomatic context that was equally troubling. According to conversations with regional partners, Pakistan had made clear it would not support American military operations against an Iran-Taliban alliance. Pakistan's prime minister had stated publicly that further escalation would threaten regional stability. Translation: Pakistan would close its airspace and borders if fighting started, which meant extraction of American personnel from Afghanistan would require either negotiation with the Taliban, which seemed unlikely if they were aligned with Iran, or high-risk military operations through hostile territory with no support from neighboring countries. General Clark let the briefings continue for 90 minutes before asking the strategic question. If we proceed with operations against Iran, knowing the Taliban might activate, what does that do to our casualty estimates and operational timeline? The J2 intelligence officer provided numbers that made the room go quiet. Current planning assumes 5,000 to 8,000 American combat deaths in a regime change operation against Iran over 18 to 24 months. If the Taliban activates 100,000 fighters and opens a second front, those numbers could increase by 20 to 30%. Not because Taliban fighters would directly engage American forces in the Gulf, but because resources would be diverted, logistics would be complicated, and regional support would collapse as countries chose neutrality rather than risk involvement in a multi-front war. Someone asked whether the Taliban threat could be neutralized through diplomatic engagement. The State Department representative's response was pessimistic. We've had no formal relations with the Taliban since the withdrawal. They don't recognize our legitimacy any more than we recognize theirs. And Iran has leverage with them that we don't. Economic support, weapons, diplomatic backing from Russia and China. If the Taliban has to choose between American threats and Iranian support, they'll choose Iran every time. The briefing concluded with General Clark's assessment. This changes the risk calculation fundamentally. We can still execute operations against Iran, but we need to assume the Taliban will act, which means we need to extract non-essential American personnel from Afghanistan immediately. We need contingency plans for embassy evacuation, and we need to brief the president that regime change in Iran might trigger a broader regional conflict that includes Afghanistan. Because that's a scenario we're not prepared for, and one that could turn a 3-month war into a 10-year commitment. Today, February 16th, 2026, Zabihullah Mujahid's statement remains the official Taliban position. Afghanistan would be prepared to cooperate with Iran in the event of a U.S. attack if requested by Tehran. The statement has not been walked back, has not been clarified, has not been softened through diplomatic channels. It stands as Taliban policy, and according to intelligence assessments compiled over the past 24 hours, the policy is backed by operational capability. The Taliban controls 100,000 to 120,000 fighters. Those fighters are positioned throughout a country that shares a 936-kilometer border with Iran. They have American weapons left behind in 2021. They have combat experience from 45 years of continuous warfare. And they have economic and diplomatic support from Iran, Russia, and to some extent China, which means they're not isolated militants who can be pressured into backing down. They're a government with resources, with capabilities, and with willingness to act if Tehran asks. The weapons inventory alone makes them formidable. According to reports compiled after the 2021 withdrawal, the Taliban acquired billions of dollars in American military equipment. Small arms, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, armored vehicles, night vision systems, communications equipment, some aircraft and helicopters, though their operational status remains uncertain. This isn't insurgent-level capability. This is government military hardware, maintained, distributed, ready for use if operations require it. And if those weapons are turned against American interests at Iran's request, every contractor in Kabul, every intelligence operative in the region, every facility that America maintains in Afghanistan becomes vulnerable in ways current security arrangements can't address. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb submitted his memo on February 16th. By February 17th, it had reached decision-makers who could change operational plans. Whether those plans will change remains unclear. The Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group continues steaming toward the Middle East. Pentagon briefings continue planning regime change operations. Trump continues saying publicly that removing Iran's government would be the best thing. But now, buried in classified assessments, is recognition that the Taliban threat is real, that Afghanistan could become Iran's Eastern Front, and that the war American planners thought would be contained to the Gulf might spread across a region where America has fewer allies, less support, and more vulnerabilities than military plans account for. The historical parallel is unavoidable. In 2001, America invaded Afghanistan to remove the Taliban. 20 years and 2,500 American lives later, the Taliban returned to power stronger than before. Now, 25 years after 9/11, those same Taliban fighters who defeated America in Afghanistan are offering to fight alongside Iran against American forces. The irony is bitter. The strategic implications are profound. Because if the Taliban activates, if they open a second front, if American personnel in Afghanistan become targets or hostages, the focused military operation against Iran becomes something else entirely. A regional war, a multi-front conflict, another Middle East intervention with unclear objectives and no realistic exit strategy. Webb knows this. General Clark knows this. The intelligence community knows this. And presumably, the president knows this or will know it soon when the assessments reach his desk. The question is whether that knowledge will change decisions, whether the Taliban threat will be treated as serious enough to pause operations until the political and military relationships in the region can be recalibrated, or whether the momentum toward conflict with Iran is too strong to stop, whether Trump's conviction that regime change is the best thing will override military advice that regime change might trigger consequences America isn't prepared to handle. The Taliban has 100,000 fighters. Iran has asked them to be prepared. The preparations, according to intelligence, are happening now. And somewhere in the chain of command, someone will have to decide whether destroying Iran's nuclear program is worth risking a war that spans from the Gulf to Central Asia, that activates militant networks across multiple countries, that could trap American personnel in a landlocked Afghanistan with no friendly neighbors and no easy extraction options. The decision will be made in Washington, but the consequences will be felt in Kabul, in Tehran, in Pakistan, in every country where the Taliban has influence and Iran has reach. Mujahid's statement was measured. He emphasized the Taliban prefers peace, hopes war can be avoided, believes Iran can defend itself without Afghan support. But if requested, if Tehran asks, Afghanistan stands ready. 100,000 fighters, 45 years of combat experience. Alliance with a regional power that can provide weapons, money, and diplomatic backing. Not enough to defeat America, but enough to complicate American plans beyond recognition. Enough to turn a surgical strike into a generational commitment. Enough to prove that even after 20 years of war, America still hasn't learned the most basic lesson. Afghanistan teaches that some fights can't be won with superior technology, that some alliances can't be broken with economic pressure, and that some enemies, once created, never stop fighting. Even when fighting seems impossible, even when defeat seems inevitable, they adapt, they align, and they wait for the moment when their most powerful adversary becomes vulnerable again. That moment, according to Taliban assessment, might be coming soon, when American carriers are committed to the Gulf, when regional allies are hedging their support, when resources are stretched across multiple theaters. That's when the Taliban, if Iran requests, will remember every lesson learned from defeating the Soviets and the Americans, will activate networks built over decades, will turn Afghanistan into what it's always been for foreign powers who underestimate it. A graveyard, not for Taliban ambitions, but for the ambitions of empires who thought they could reshape the region through force. The statement has been made. The threat is credible, and the decision whether to test Taliban resolve is approaching faster than anyone in Washington wants to acknowledge.
Shalom. First and foremost, giving all praises, honor, glory, and worship unto Yahweh, Bahasham Yahushai, Bahasham Rachakodash. Double honors unto the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and Greetings and salutations unto you, Achim, upholding the testimony of our Lord and Savior, Yahushai, in truth and in sincerity. All right. So for this lesson, there should be a clip of a video speaking about the plausible alliance between Iran and Taliban and the Afghan Taliban in case or in the situation of an invasion or a prolonged invasion of Iran. And that indeed would be biblical prophecy. So whether if it's this instance where they strike Iran now or a latter instance, because they're going to continue, if this isn't the last strike on Iran, that whenever it takes place, it will continue until the consummation of what the world knows as World War III. And so this is Obadiah, the first chapter, first verse. It says, the vision of Obadiah, thus saith the Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. Edom would be speaking of NATO, the EU, America, right? It says, we have heard a rumor from Yahweh, an ambassador is sent among the heathen. Arise ye and let us rise up against her in battle. Right, so these nations, though they have differences, those differences will be put to the side from their perspective, a greater good, which is coming up against America, because America, they're not smart, and they're covetous, and so it causes the convenience for nations to side with them to not make sense. All right, so the other option will be taken by these nations, which is to fight against America and the Edomites. All right, but let's talk specifically America, because you have other nations that are Edomites, right? But this prophecy in this part of this chapter specifically is more so going into America. All right, verse 2, and also it boils over and applies to EU and NATO, but more prominently America. Verse 2. It says, behold, I have made thee small among the heathen. Thou art greatly despised. And in that video, it speaks about U.S. military assets, military base still in Afghanistan, only sums of a few hundred people. And that's small. And that term small is actually, when you go into it, it goes into insignificant. So the Americans are looked at, the Edomites are looked at as being insignificant. They're abhorred. Verse 3, the pride of thine heart have deceived thee. Right, because their pride and their arrogance is drunk in them. Just caused them to make bad decisions, bad choices. It says, thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock. That's talking about them being in a fortified position on earth and operating from a position of power. It says, whose habitation is high, right? It's going to them, controlling the financial system, being on top of the food chain, as it seems, or for lack of a better term, as far as the nations and the populations of the earth. It says, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? Right. So they don't believe they can be brought down from their position of fortification. Their fortified position via their technology, via the financial system. But they've weaponized certain of these things in an unwise manner, which has caused them to not have allies. So now you look at the likes of Pakistan, who is a pivotal ally of America in Central Asia, and in World War III, they're not going to align with America. They're not. If America attacks Iran, the Pakistanis aren't going to align with America. One, Iran has ballistic missiles that can target Pakistani bases. Two, the Pakistani population won't be okay with America, attacking Iran, which is politically going to cause their leadership not to be okay with it, not to partake in it. All right. It says, though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, going to the satellite technology, the different aerial technology. It says, thence will I bring thee down, saith Yahweh, the Space Force, so on and so forth. You also can apply to, of course, there's layers to the onion. You can apply to when they so-called went to the moon, but prophetically is more so going into the technology they have now. And the Lord's bringing them down now. It speaks about the stars of heaven falling, which that applies to the missiles, but it also applies to the leadership, the rulership, the powers in that dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high. They're going to be brought down. The elites. Let's see here. Verse 5. Let's go down. Yeah, let's do verse 7. It says, all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee. Right. We see that taking place. Geopolitically, in Chad, in these different countries of West Africa. That's another topic. But let's continue to talk about Central Asia. Let's talk about Pakistan. Ally, right? Okay. Now let's think. If the Pakistanis aren't aligned with an American intervention, and they're a nuclear power, by the way, and they're also backed by China, right? Who else is a chief ally of Pakistan? Turkey. Who's allied with Turkey? The different Eurasian countries that also border Iran in the Eurasian steppe. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, which also border Afghanistan, right? And that's when you go into the book of Ezekiel, the 38th chapter, when it speaks about Gomer, which is going into Turkey, geographically, from a proximity point of view. Now, we're not talking about the exact point. Just like when we talk about Gog wasn't Moscow. It wasn't what you consider Russia today. A lot of that was no man's land, but it was in the proximity, and prophetically is going into Russia, right? So Ezekiel the 38th chapter, it speaks about Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah, so on and so forth, right? That's talking about those different Turkish nations. Those are the bands of Gomer. So we see geopolitically how those who were at peace with thee have deceived thee. We know prophetically Turkey's going to fight on the side of Russia. Oh, if Turkey's fighting on the side of Russia, who's Pakistan fighting on the side of? Oh, what? We know in Ezekiel, the 38th chapter, the first nation mentioned to fight on the side of Gog or Russia is who? Persia. Who is that talking about? Iran. Uh-oh. You're in trouble. A lot of it. See? The spirit is undefeated. Let's go to Joel, the 2nd chapter, and we'll conclude with it. Yeah, you're in trouble. You're in trouble, and these elites that control you, talking to the average, like, American general, or he takes orders from the elites, but I'm an American, I'm a patriot, but look what you're doing, right? But those people who are above you, they thinking, oh, we just going to go somewhere, we're going to let them fight it out, and we're going to, we're going to wiggle our way out. No, you're not going to wiggle your way out of it. Because when the beast infrastructure falls, it's going to escalate, it's going to get bad, and it's going to end up with a thermonuclear conflict. And so where is your power system? Oh, they think that they're going to go to nuclear war and we're going to crawl our way out. No, you're not going to crawl your way out. You're going to slither your way. We're going to go this part of the earth. We're going, where the war isn't taking place, and we got our bunkers over here. No, it's not going to work. It was an idea you had, but it's not going to work. Why? Because prophecy is prophecy. Joel, the 2nd chapter, verse 1, it says, blow ye the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Which that's speaking of the nation of Israel, to tell the nation of Israel these prophecies. It says, let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of Yahweh cometh, for it is nigh at hand, a day of darkness and of gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness, as the morning spread upon the mountains, a great people and a strong. Now, you might think this, it's talking about armies. No, it's not talking about armies. It's talking about missiles. It says, there have not been ever the like, neither shall be any more after it, even to the years of many generations. It's talking about missiles. It says, a fire devoureth before them, and behind them a flame burneth. It's talking about the projectile, so on and so forth, of the missiles and the actual destruction. When we continue to read, it says, the land is as the Garden of Eden before them. Right, so before the missiles actually touch down on the United States. The United States, when you look at, you go to Colorado, you go to Wyoming, you go to these different parts of America, it is beautiful. It is just absolutely beautiful. You go to Florida, you go to Maine, you go to North Georgia, you go to Appalachian Mountains, you go to these different parts of you go to Oregon, you go to these Washington State, you go to these different. This is the Garden of Eden. It is absolutely beautiful, a blessed place geographically and geologically. But that's why it says the land is as the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Now, how's that? Well, that's because this beautiful country is going to be destroyed by thermonuclear missiles. It says, yeah, and nothing shall escape them. Okay? It says the appearance of them is as the appearance of horses, and as horsemen. You talk about horsepower, things of that nature with certain vehicle technology. The term horse represents biblically is a symbolic term that represents power. All right. It says, so shall they run. It says, like the noise of chariots on the tops of mountains shall they leap. You hear the missiles in the air, growling, right? It says, this is like the noise of a flame of fire that devoureth the stubble. Wait a minute. Horses devour. What is this talking? Well, that's talking about missiles. That's why. Yep. It says, as a strong people set in battle array. It says, before their face, the people shall be much pain. All faces shall gather blackness. Right. But when they see these missiles and these warheads coming out of the heavens, people literally they're gonna have heart attacks. They're gonna be shitting themselves. It's gonna be their worst nightmare. It says, they shall run like mighty men. They shall climb the wall like man of war, and they shall march everyone on his own ways. It's talking about the trajectory of the missiles. And they shall not break their ranks. Right. They're not going to be compromised. They're not going to deviate from their target. They're going to hit the target. Why? Because the Spirit of the Lord is in the missiles. And they don't even have no good missile defense system. And how you going to defend all of America? And how you don't even have enough defense for all the warheads. Furthermore, the Heavenly Father, he's going to turn off any type of defense system. He's going to cause every single warhead to hit the location that they've been assigned to. We're going to read that right here. It says, neither shall one thrust another. It says, they shall walk every one in his path, and when they fall upon the sword, they shall not be wounded. Right. There's not going to be, they're not going to be compromised. The missiles are going to hit the target. It says, they shall run to and fro in the city. They shall run upon the wall. They shall climb up upon the houses. They shall enter in at the windows like a thief. Right. It's going to be, oh, goodness. We didn't expect that. Yeah, it's a hypersonic missile. I bet you didn't expect it. It says, the earth shall quake before them. What's going to cause the earth to quake? A nuclear missile detonating. You can read that also in the book of Revelations. It's talk about a great earthquake. What's that? Revelations, I forgot what chapter it was. You type in a great earthquake. Let me see. Let's see here. Revelation 16, 18. Yep. It says, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as not was since man was upon earth. So mighty an earthquake, so great. That's talking about the missiles. All right. Anyway, let's go back to Joel. So I'm gonna wrap it up there. That's it. I can continue, but I'll just wrap it up with that. So we have to be vigilant and spiritual, praying to Yahweh Bashim Yahshua to be delivered from these times. So Lord willing, this lesson was edifying, giving our praise to Yahweh Bashim Yahshua. Shalom.